The first sample we'll work on is the hand sewing sample, and I'll be using this hand sewing practice pattern from your sample book patterns. If you don't have the sample book patterns or this isn't printed, that's perfectly fine. I'll walk you through all of the measurements so you can draft it yourself directly on your fabric. But reading this pattern, I can see that I should cut one from muslin, so I have to cut one copy of this out of muslin, and it has my grain line identified. If you look very closely, you'll see a series of small dots printed on the page as well. I'm going to transfer all those dots onto my fabric so I can give myself a guide for when I'm hand sewing. Now we know where the grain line is, and from the last video, we know the orientation for it. We should line up the grain line of the pattern parallel to the selvage edge. So this would lay on your fabric like this, parallel to your selvage edge. You would then pin this in place through the fabric and the pattern. Don't forget to align your pattern. Measuring from the selvage edge to make sure it is aligned as accurately to the grain line as possible. Pin this down. Now, pinning your patterns is a technique in and of itself. I pin my patterns on bias. We had a talk about the bias on fabric. When I say that I pin on bias, I mean that I pin at an angle. So rather than pinning straight up and down or horizontally with the grain or the cross grain, I like to pin on bias. Now, why is that? If for some reason I'm pinning up and down like this and I cut this out and I throw all the patterns and whatnot, I keep it pinned, but I'm just keeping it in my workroom, or in your case, you might be traveling with it. If you sometimes these will slide out. This is more likely to slide out. It's more likely for this fabric to kind of shift, for the pattern to shift or the fabric to shift underneath it. But pinning on bias, if something gets pulled vertically or horizontally, it's not going to move too much. And it's just a matter of preference. So I usually pin on bias to help prevent any shifting of the pattern or the fabric underneath. And then you can go in with a pair of scissors, ideally a pair of paper scissors, something that will go through the paper comfortably, and you can cut the pattern and the paper, the pattern and the fabric all at once. Now I have already cut a piece of muslin to the size of the pattern. And again, if you do not have this pattern, it's all right. This is a 9-inch by 6-inch rectangle. So you can draft out 9 inches on the grain line of your fabric and 6 inches along the cross grain and complete this 9-inch and 6-inch rectangle. So I've done that. It is 9 inches, and I will mark my grain line because we want to make sure we keep that on grain. 9 inches along the grain, 6 inches along the cross grain. So if you ever hear someone say, cut a rectangle 9 inches on grain, 6 inches on cross, that's what we mean. 9 inches on the grain of the fabric, 6 inches on the cross grain. Now, for all of these little dots inside of the pattern, I'm going to zoom in so you can see the measurements we're going to make. Along one of the edges, I'll go to this bottom edge here, along one of the long edges, the 9-inch edges, take your clear ruler and measure 3/8 of an inch from that cut edge. I'm placing the 3/8 inch mark from my ruler on the cut edge of my fabric, making sure it is aligned. 3 of these small squares are 3/8. That is lined up pretty good, and I'm going to draw a line on my muslin at that 3/8 inch offset. I'm using my Friction brand pen so I can iron these away when I'm done with my sewing. I highly, highly, highly recommend you do the same. Along the shorter edges of the muslin, I'm also going to measure in 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to place a little tick mark on this edge here. And I'm going to continue these lines up along the edges of my piece of fabric here, because we're going to use these marks later. Same thing over here, 3/8 of an inch in from the short edge, make a little tick mark, and then give myself a guideline along the edge here. So you can see I've just made some guidelines, 3/8 of an inch in. You'll see why I've done that in just a moment. And I've just made little tick marks on my 3/8 inch line here. Now along this line that I've made, I'm going to put a few marks, again 3/8 of an inch from each other. So I'm going to work my way along this piece of this, along this line here. Starting here, looks like the number 2 on my ruler. 1, 2, 3 little squares and make another tick mark. 1, 2, 3, make a tick mark. 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. And we should have these equally spaced. If you followed all the directions, you should have tick marks evenly spaced along this line. And these are going to give us a guideline for where we should be sewing for one of our stitches that we're going to create on this sample. Now you can use transfer paper and a tracing wheel to transfer these marks onto your pattern, onto your fabric from your pattern, or you can draw them in. This is to show you what you can do if you do not have the pattern. I'm going to go to the other end of my sample here, the other long edge. I'm going to start making a few more lines for myself. I'm going to measure 3/4 of an inch in from that edge. 3/4 of an inch. This is 1/4, 1/2, 3/4. That's 6 of these tiny squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, give myself a horizontal guideline. I'm going to continue this all the way down. I'm going to make 6 lines, and they will all be 3/4 of an inch spaced apart. So this is line number 1. That's all done. I'll use that to then measure out for line number 2. Again, 3/4 of an inch away. That's 6 tiny squares. That's 1 line. That's 2 lines. Let's do another. 3/4 of an inch. There we go. 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to do 3 more. One, 2, and 3. So you should have one line 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge with 3/8 inch tick marks all along it. You should have some guidelines at 3/8 of an inch along this bottom edge of your sample. And you should have 6 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, measuring 3/4 of an inch from this opposite raw edge. And again, 3/4 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, 3/4, 3/4, and 3/4. So 6 lines. And that should start to look somewhat similar to what we have on the pattern here. I'm sorry, it's this direction. Here's my 3/8 until I get to these little points here, which are spaced 3/8 of an inch apart. And then my other lines here, this is 3/4 of an inch away to get this line of dots, and 3/4 of an inch to this line of dots, so on and so forth. You'll notice that the dots here are spaced further apart than the dots further down here. So let's map out those tick marks now. Down here at the bottom, where we have our 3/8 inch line with our 3/8 tick marks, I'm going to move up to the next line above it, and starting where my guideline that I marked, 3/8 of an inch in on either side, I'm going to start from that. That's my first point, and I'm going to measure 1/4 inches all the way across. So 1/4 inch is 2 little squares on your ruler. So there we go, 1/4 inch. All the way across. There we go. I'm going to do the same for this line and this line. Again, starting where I made my guidelines, measuring 1/4 inch, and you should find this will evenly divide into 1/4 inch segments. Remember, 1/4 inch is 2 of the little squares on your ruler. And one more time up to here, doing the same thing, 1/4 inch marks all the way across. All right, so I've got this line here, 3/8 of an inch from the edge, 3/8 of an inch measured in from either side, and 3/8 of an inch divided all the way along. 3 lines above that, 1/4 inch marks all the way along, measuring 3/8 of an inch on either side. Again, 1/4 inch marks, 1/4 inch marks. Now up here at the top, we're going to do something similar. We're going to place our marks 1/2 inch apart. And to do that, I'm going to measure in 1/2 inch from my shorter edges and make my original tick mark. Again, this will be a 1/2 inch in, not 3/8. It's a little bit larger than that. 1/2 inch is 4 of the little squares on your ruler. 1, 2, 3, 4 little squares. In between these tick marks that I've made, I'm just going to divide each of these lines into 1/2 inch segments. Again, 4 little squares on your ruler, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and so on and so forth. Okay, we should be all set with all of our lines marked. If your sample does not look like mine, go and rewatch the instructions for marking it, because otherwise your final project, your final sample will not look the same. Now let's get on with the hand sewing. We've marked our fabric, we know where our marks are. Now when you go to hand sew, typically on a garment, you're not going to mark your fabric like this. This is for practice to get you accustomed to how to space your stitches. When you actually go to hand sew, you have to grow accustomed to just eyeballing these distances and determining the length of each of your stitches just from looking at it. But this is to help you get started. I have the thread. I've got my needle threaded. It's all ready to go. I've got a red thread on here. Please use a contrasting color, either red or black or blue, something that will show up against this fabric. And I have it threaded, and as I mentioned in my previous video, I have a single length of thread. So I have one tail that is shorter than the other. I'm going to use my long tail and place a knot in it, as you saw in my previous video. There we go, teeny tiny little knot. And I'm going to start with this line up here, this line that has the 1/2 inch marks on it. And I'm going to zoom way in so you can see exactly what I'm doing. I am right-handed, so I'll be working from the right side of my sample. If you are left-handed, by all means, you can work from left to right, but I am right-handed, so I will be working from right to left. Got my needle, and I'm going to place my needle underneath my fabric and push the tip of the needle up through this first mark that I've made. So there's the tip of my needle coming up through that first mark. I'm going to pull my needle through, pull all of my thread, and it should stop at the back because of that tiny little knot that I put in there. If for some reason you tug on this and it slides out, try making your knot again. Try a larger knot. Wrap it around the needle a couple more times to make yourself a larger knot. Or you can try my friction knot making technique. That'll give you a nice big nest of thread that is not likely to come through the fabric. So give it a tug, make sure it doesn't slide right out. And if it does, please redo the knot tying. So I brought my needle up through this point. I'm now going to take my needle, and now my needle is at the front of my work. I'm going to push my needle down through the next point. So I push that tip of my needle down through my next line, my next cross mark. I'm going to pull that through. And I've just made my first stitch. I just went up through this point and came down through this point, and I've just made my first hand stitch. I'm going to move on to this next. Now all of my thread and my needle are on the back of my sample. So I'm going to put my needle up through this cross mark here. There's the tip of my needle. Pull that through. Check on the back to make sure nothing's getting tangled back there. And move on to the next one. Down through this next point, this next cross mark. Needle point down through that point on my fabric. There's my needle. I'm going to pull that through to the back side of my work. And I will keep continuing this, pushing up from the back. You'll see I'm placing my thumb right here. It gives my needle a little bit of resistance when I'm pushing from the back. I can feel where my thumb is, and I can get an idea of gauging where to place my needle point. I also have my pointer finger underneath here. It helps to stabilize my needle. Pull that through and back down through the next point. Up through the next one. Again, I've got my my pointer finger underneath there, stabilizing the needle. Got my thumb here to help guide where the needle should go, and back down through here. And back up. And back down. Now, when you get to the last point, And remember, as long as you haven't put a knot in at the eye of your needle, you can always pull on your needle and you will find that your thread tail will shorten, giving you more thread to sew with. So you can always adjust the length of the thread you're sewing with. When I get to this last point, I'm going to come up through this last cross point that I've got on my sample. Pull this up. And now we're going to anchor our stitches. If we don't put some kind of anchor into this, these stitches could slide out. I'll show you very quickly. I'm going to grab a seam ripper here, and I can just pull this stitch right on out. There's nothing holding it in place over here, so I'm going to pull that back into place. And to anchor my stitch, I'm going to zoom in even further. I'm going to take my needle. I'm going to take a tiny little stitch. I'll set it over here away from my cross mark so you can see what I'm doing. Teeny tiny little stitch in and out. I have my finger underneath my fabric. So when I push through, and you got to do this gently, very carefully, I'm going to push the tip of my needle through the fabric. I can feel it poking me in the finger underneath. So I know that I've gotten through the fabric, and I'm going to use my finger as an anchor for me to then pinch my fabric up and push the tip of the needle out. So I've just picked up a couple of fibers on my fabric. Again, descend the needle in and back out, using your finger at the back as a anchor, as a gauge, and then pull your needle through. Take one tiny little stitch. It's essentially the same thing that we've done here, just much smaller. And I'm going to do that one more time. In and out, tiny little stitch. And I'm going to start to pull my thread through. As I pull my thread through, I'm going to slow down and wait until I have a loop of thread here. Once I have that loop, I'm going to put my needle through that loop of thread. Just going to pick it up and stick my needle through that loop of thread. Pick up the needle on the other side and then pull everything through. That'll give me a tiny little anchored knot. So if I come back with my seam ripper, start to tug on this, it's not going anywhere. It's going to hold it in place. You can do that one more time if you'd like. Take a tiny little stitch, pull it slowly through. Once that loop, you get close to the end of that loop forming in your thread, put your needle through that loop, pick it up on the other side, and then pull everything together. That'll give you a second knot just to make sure everything is in place. Don't tug too hard when you're doing these stitches. Let the thread anchor itself in the fabric on its own. I'm going to snip my thread, leaving a teeny little tail. And that is my first line of stitching done. It's a little difficult to see with my markings, but once I iron this, you'll see what's going on. Let me go ahead and iron that really quickly just so you can see what's happening on this top edge. So I just went to the iron, and as I mentioned, these Friction brand pens are heat erasable. They do not go clear, they actually go white, but that white is imperceptible on this light colored fabric. So now you can clearly see my stitches where I started and my tiny little knot at the back where I came up and down and up and down, up and down, up and down, so on and so forth until I came up on this end, took two tiny stitches and made two little anchoring knots there. And you'll see if I flip this over, it looks almost identical on the back side. This is what is called a running stitch. A running stitch. This is one of the fastest stitches that you can do, and you're going to be using this a lot. This is also referred to as a basting stitch. When you want to connect pieces of your fabric during garment making, this can be much more secure than a set of pins. Sometimes pins get in the way while you're sewing, and you want to instead put basting stitches to anchor your work before you put it into the sewing machine. The great thing about these running stitches, basting stitches, is as long as you don't knot it too many times on this end, you can easily snip through your stitches, take a pair of scissors or take a seam ripper to it, and you can pull all of these stitches out really quickly. It can seem very time consuming on the front end, but again, it saves you a lot of time on the back end. Go ahead and repeat this same process on the next line, doing the same running stitches, starting from the same side, up and down, up and down, up and down. If you are left-handed and you're working from this side, that's perfectly fine. You can work from this side, up and down, up and down, up and down, and put your little knots over here. I'm going to go ahead and do my next line, and I'm going to show you another technique for sewing these basting stitches a little bit faster. Got a nasty knot on that one. All right, same technique, up through one side, and I'm going to go down through the other. Just going to get that started, give it a pull, make sure it doesn't come through, and then I'll show you how I do this much faster. I'm going to place my non-dominant hand under my fabric and kind of fold it up. I'm kind of walking my fingers along the back here, crunching it up as I go until I can get a good anchor on this side of my sample. And again, going down through one. And before I go to pull this through on the back side, I'm just going to push the needle through. Again, I'm using my fingers on the back to anchor the needle. Got my middle finger back here that's anchoring the needle. It gives me a support, and I can push the needle up through the next piece of fabric and pull that through. Same thing, I'm just going to go to the next. Push down, anchor it with my finger in the back, and push the needle back up. So I've now gone down and up all in one stroke. It's about twice as fast as pulling the needle manually. And as I work my way towards the opposite side of my sample, I'm just pulling the fabric nice and smooth. I should not see, don't pull your thread super tight. Don't pull it super tight. If at times you start sewing and you see that your fabric kind of bunching on itself, just pull the fabric back out and let the threads loosen themselves. Down and up. There we go. Again, my finger is underneath here as an anchor, as a base. Down and back up. And again, I will make my little anchoring knots. I'll zoom in so you can see that one more time. Tiny little stitch in and out of the fabric all at once. You can see on the back there's a little bit of my needle showing. Pull that through one more time. Down and up. Pull it slowly. When I get that loop, stick my needle through that loop. Pick it up on the other side, pull it taut to give myself a little bit of an anchor. Snip my thread. Second row done. Please excuse my iron making noise in the background. For this next line, we're going to follow the same markings, 1/2 inch all the way across, but I want you to, instead of one thickness of thread, use a double thickness of thread. So I'm going to take my two thread ends and put them side by side. And I'll use the same technique to tie a knot in the ends of my thread. So now I've got my needle and both ends of my thread. That gave me a big nasty knot. I don't want that knot. Okay, that's not too bad. Not my favorite knot, but it shall work. So long as you have both ends knotted together, you should be good to go. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. Start from the back, come up and down, up and down, up and down. Except I'm using a double length of thread. You'll want to use a double length of thread when you're doing more secure stitches, when you want to sew things a little bit faster. Buttons are a prime example of working with a double length of thread. You get twice as much strength in your stitch when you're anchoring a button to your fabric, and you don't have to loop your thread over and over and over again nearly as many times as you would if you had a single length of thread. I'm starting to run out of thread on my needle here, and I can see my fabric wanting to bunch up, so I have to keep releasing the tension on my fabric. Before I tie everything off, just going to lay my fabric flat, make sure I'm not getting any bunching or looping on the back. And then I will anchor my stitches with some tiny little stitches. Now, anchoring your stitches, this is just one way to do it. You can take a tiny stitch, and as that loop closes, go ahead and stick your needle in the first time. I do it twice just for a little bit more security, but there's more than one way to complete everything that we are doing for these samples. So that's the first 3 done. 1/2 inch wide stitches, 1/2 inch long stitches with a single length of thread, another row of 1/2 inch long stitches with a single length of thread, and a row of 1/2 inch long stitches with a double length of thread. So you should have the same stitches on your sample as well. Moving down to the next 3 lines, we're going to do the exact same thing, but obviously these will be 1/4 of an inch wide stitches. I'm going to use a single length of thread here. Again, up and down, up and down, up and down, all the way to the end, and anchor it at the end. Single length of thread here, and a double length of thread here. So it'll be the same repetition, single, single, and double, single, single, and double, 1/2 inch stitches, 1/4 inch stitches. Again, apologize for my iron. Make sure you're starting at your 3/8 inch mark so that your stitching is long enough from one side of the sample to the other. And you will see me do the same technique. I've bunched up my fabric here on my non-dominant hand, pushing my needle down and back up. And depending on the length of your needle, you can pick up multiple stitches at the same time. Down and back up. You can probably get those 2 stitches done at once. This is why it's called a running stitch. Your needle runs through the fabric. You're just running your needle up and down through the fabric. So again, I am using my fingers underneath as a rest for and a support for my needle. Down and up using my marks that I placed on my fabric. Doesn't have to be perfect, but try to be as accurate as possible. And again, the more you do this, the more it becomes second nature. And you will start learning how to gauge the width of your stitches just by looking at them. And anchor my stitches at the end here. Slightly different number of stitches than the 1/2 inch samples. Same technique, 2 tiny stitches, needle through that loop of thread and pull it tight. Not too tight, but taut. I'll show you one more time, still single length of thread, and I'll zoom in so you can see that running stitch technique of going in and out through multiple stitches at once. Bunching up my fabric from my non-dominant hand to my dominant hand, coming up through this first mark, down and back up and back down and back out, back up. I still have my fingers underneath here serving as an anchor so I can feel when the needle descends. I am not stabbing myself with the needle. You have to be delicate with this. As soon as you feel the tip of that needle come through your fabric, move your finger away. And then you can tilt the tip of the needle up towards the fabric and then place your finger underneath it just along the length of the needle to support it. You'll see me do this from time to time. I'll push the needle down and you'll see me tilt my fabric towards the needle. You can manipulate the needle in and out of the fabric. You can manipulate the fabric onto the needle. There you go again. Kind of manipulating the fabric onto it. And bring the needle back up. Pull that through. I just did 2-3 stitches at once, 2 stitches. So practice this. Make your muslin with the marks on it, and then, you know, take some time, sit down on the couch, maybe sit on the patio, and sew some running stitches, because believe me, you're going to be using this a lot. Not only throughout the course, but throughout your sewing career. Oops. Now I have waxed and pressed my thread, but it still wants to bunch up on me, probably because my thread is so long. Okay, 2 rows of quarter inch wide stitches at a single length of thread. I'm now going to do my last row with a double length of thread. Same technique. Up through that point and back down. I'm going to go through this much faster. Got a little bit of a loop forming here. I'm just going to tug on each of my threads to smooth that out. Make sure I smooth my fabric back out. Okay. Three rows of stitching, 1/4 inch spacing, single length, double length. I'm going to go iron these really quickly. I don't want to lose my stitches, my marks down here, but I'm going to iron the rest of them so you can see what these look like. Okay, so I've ironed those marks away from my friction pen so you can see the difference between the single length of thread and a double length of thread, and the difference in size for these stitches. If I flip this over, it should look like a mirror image on the back. There shouldn't be any threads tangled up or anything. And we are set to go for our last stitch down here. We're not doing a running stitch here. We're going to do a hand overcast stitch. This is a stitch designed to help prevent fraying along a cut edge of fabric. Now the stitch that we're going to be doing is very large, just so you can clearly see what we're doing. So it wouldn't be terribly practical for keeping the edge of this fabric from fraying, but you might consider doing a stitch like this, maybe a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge with 1/4 inch spacing from one stitch to the next. But so you can clearly see what's happening while sewing this, I have everything spaced at 3/8 of an inch to make it a little bit larger, a little bit clearer. I've got my needle threaded. I have a single length of thread that I have knotted. There's one tail here, the other tail here, and I've got my knot at the end of my longer tail. Again, I'm going to start from my right because I am right hand dominant. If you are left hand dominant, you are welcome to work from left to right. I'm going from right to left, picking up my work with my left hand, and let me zoom in here so you can see what I'm doing. Starting from the right, I'm going to again come up from behind using my fingers underneath to help support my needle. I'm going to come all the way up and pull my thread through. Make sure that knot is secure. Make sure it doesn't come through to the front of my work. So I just came up from behind and I've hidden my knot at the back of my work. I'm now going to take my needle. Normally with the running stitch, we'd be on the front of the work and we go down to the back, but we're going to do the exact same stitch we just did. I'm taking my needle, I'm going to put it underneath my work again and come up from behind through this next mark and pull that through. Now as I start pulling it, you see my thread is hanging over here. I need to guide that thread all the way to the raw edge of my sample because this is what I want to overcast, to hand overcast. Now where the position of your thread goes, whether it sits closer to here towards the middle between the two stitches or over here, is up to you. You have to guide the thread into the position that you want, but keep it consistent. You can see my thread's wanting to go all the way up over here. I don't want that, so I'm going to scoot it back around to the edge here and slowly pull my thread. Now I've got one stitch in this direction, another stitch in this direction. I don't want that. I want consistency with my stitches. So I'm going to just nudge it over, give it a tug until both of these have a similar angle to them. Next one, again, taking my needle from underneath the fabric up through the next mark, pull this through, guide my thread around, hold it in place. I'm still using my finger under there to hold my thread in place. This keeps wants to going over there, so I'm going to scoot it back, tug it in place so that I have consistent stitches. I will continue all the way to the end of this sample. If you find some of your stitches are a little bit loose, you can tug on each of the threads. Take your time with this because that thread is going to be stubborn. Again, make sure you're finger pressing your fabric so it doesn't coil up. Now, what happens, you might be asking, if you're working on some hand sewing and you run out of thread? You can do the exact same thing that I did over here. Place a tiny little anchoring stitch either on preferably on the back of your work, and then start a new line of stitching. Rethread your needle and start a new line of stitching. It is very rare when you're going to have enough thread to finish one entire line of hand sewing, depending on what you're working on. Hand basting a zipper into place, yeah, you should have plenty of thread. But hand stitching the hem of a skirt, not so much. You probably will have to rethread your needle a few times. Make sure this lays flat. I'm going to tug on some of my stitches to loosen them up, because I feel like it is causing the edge of my fabric to curl up on itself. Again, if you were to use this to actually finish off the edge of a piece of fabric, you would more than likely use smaller stitches. But for demonstration purposes, and so you grow accustomed to the process of this type of stitch, we've made them nice big stitches that you can clearly see. Almost there, one last stitch. And again, I'm just going to make sure my fabric is nice and laid flat before I anchor anything down. I'll tighten up a couple of these stitches, loosen up some others. And then I will place my anchor stitch, one tiny little stitch there, and through the loop, pull it tight. Trim the thread ends. Just remove any extra little, snip off any little bits that are hanging off. Just make sure you're not snipping your threads that you work so hard to sew into there. There we go. And go ahead and press it. If you've used the friction pen, be sure to press this so you get rid of all the marks. You can cleanly see your work. And now you can label your work and photograph it. Be sure to label it as hand sewing sample or hand sewing practice. Take a photo of this, photograph it from the front, flip it over and photograph it from the back so that you can have that ready for submission.